Hi, I'm Jody Tomaso at UC Davis. And before I talk about weed science aspects, I want to tell a little story. This came from a TED Talk. In Namibia, they have a problem with poaching of large wildlife and endangered species. And they were trying to figure out how to solve this problem. The penalty for poaching is death, and so when they captured poachers, they killed them. But there were still lots of poachers and a lot of poaching going on. And the reason for this is because people didn't have enough money and had no jobs to feed their family, and so it was worth the risk of poaching. So they thought, how do we solve this problem? And typically, when people think about this, they say, well, yeah, we got to cut back on poaching. But in Namibia, they thought out of the box. They said, well, who knows the land better than anybody else? Who knows the wildlife? Who knows the area? And it turned out that the people that knew it the best were the poachers. So what they did to solve this problem is they hired the poachers to protect the animals and also to steward the land. And since they did that, there is no poaching anymore, the animals are recovering, and they've solved the problem. Now this, you might think, has nothing to do with weed science, but as you'll see, I'll get back to this story when I talk about how research in ecology will fit into management. Now one of the questions I was asked to address is why we fail to employ aspects of theory in management. But I want to turn that question around a little bit and say, why do we fail to employ aspects of management in theory? So let's first talk about the aspect of ecology, and you could say ecological invasion theory too. Now ecologists, in my mind, and this is my opinion, spend a good deal of their time defining problems, and they're a bit disjunct from actually working on management issues. And I don't know why this is. Perhaps ecologists don't feel that management is worthy of their study, or perhaps they look down at any kind of control strategy as being important. And so, for example, what you're seeing now is a field of yellow star thistle, and it's almost a 100% cover of yellow star thistle. I feel a lot of students working in ecology would go out to this field and say, gee, we're going to look at the change in the overall plant diversity within this field and a non-infested field. In other words, in my mind, they're oftentimes just proving the obvious. There's no management implication at all related to that. So it seems to me that a lot of ecologists do not include management as part of their thought process or their research. If you look at all the different ecologists, plant ecologists we have in the country, or even within my own university, you will see that we are outnumbered 10 to 1 in terms of ecologists that look at just pure ecology and ecologists that maybe, or other people working on invasive plants that are interested in management aspects. And so this to me is a real problem in our ability to properly manage invasive plants over large landscape conditions. Now let's look at the other end of it, the management side of it. In the history of weed science, which began about 60 years ago or so, most of it was agricultural research, and most of the people that became the early weed scientists were agronomists. And they were used to putting out fertilizer trials. So it wasn't really a big transition for them to switch from fertilizers to herbicides. And so many of the early weed scientists were looking at herbicides and their effect on particular weeds. Now we've managed to change a little bit over the time, particularly in California where I live, so I can speak to that, in that we do look at other strategies and we even look at other ecological principles. But still today, one of the common things we hear is, what do I use to control X weed in Y area? So what do I think we need to do as scientists, both the practitioner working on management and the ecologist looking at various theory? Well, you can see, if you look at this graph, that we don't overlap much, at least in my opinion. And what we really need to do is not shift the tails of what we do, but to expand within each other's range so that there's a lot more overlap in how we conduct our research and what our goals are and our objectives are in our research, where we interplay the different ecological theory in our management strategies. And I think we need to do that much more. Ecologists need to work more with practitioners. So what's the solution to this? I mean, how do we get people to work together on these things? Well, Clearly, there's many ways of doing it. Some is through funding, through various agencies, or the federal government. It seems to me that the grants that are offered through the AFRI program focus primarily on theoretical aspects of, or mechanistic aspects of weed science, and really pay lip service to management. Even when we had the integrated grants, they were, in my mind, very weak on the management aspects. And I think the two need to be put together in those grants to be successful in obtaining funding. So, that's a good point of discussion within our conference. But now I want to get back to that Namibia story. You're probably wondering how I was going to link that. So the solution to the Namibia story, of course, was to think out of the box and how we might pull groups together, what we considered to be, perhaps in their case, enemies. And there's a lot of things that we could do within our field that could be the same. For example, I think right now ecologists look at ranchers as being the enemy. And I think ranchers look at ecologists as being the enemy, or out of touch with reality, proposing things that are impossible for them to do economically or sustainably. So we don't look at each other as being stewards for the same purpose. And we should look more at us being partners in solving this problem together. Make the land managers part of the solution. Don't treat them like the enemies or the poachers. Same thing could apply in the nursery industry when we're talking about the introduction of ornamental plants. We can't make the nursery industry the enemy. Let's make them part of the solution. Let's work together. Let's partner together to solve the problems. So the Namibia story, to me, has a lot of value in the way we might think about solving the problems that we have with invasive species, not just plants, but all invasive species. With other species, it could be working with the pet industry, with animals. So there's a lot of ways in which we can learn from that Namibia story, and we could start to look at how to solve problems differently than perhaps we have in the past. And I hope to have that as part of our discussion during this 4 days in Montana.